colleagues, dear guests, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and privilege for me to welcome Professor Gary Marcus, who is a leading voice in the field of artificial intelligence. Thank you, Professor Gary Marcus, for accepting the invitation of the Presidential Committee for Public Education of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Thank you. And now I ask Professor Csaba Pléh, a Hungarian psychologist, linguist, a full member of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, an honor of the Széchenyi Prize, who has just received the most prestigious academic award of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, the Academic Golden Medal, on Monday this week. So please give an applause to him. And now I ask Professor Csaba Pléh to give his opening speech and introduce us, Professor Gary Marcus. Csaba, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's an honor to be able to present Gary Marcus. Gary Marcus is, I would be criticized if I would say that he's the youngest Emeritus Professor of New York University, so I would say, because my junior colleagues always criticize me that I commit the error of ageism. So I'm not going to talk about his age, but he certainly is the most dynamic and most active Emeritus Professor of New York University. Many of us here in this building had known Gary for quite a time. He has been visiting Hungary in the 1990s, giving talks in Budapest at the nascent Seminar of Cognitive Science and even at Page. I still remember, you can locate the time by this remark, that he was just publishing one of his foremost papers in cognition, and he was going through the proofs, and we had to find a decent fax machine in Page to fax the proof corrections. You can imagine, so that was a time when there were no editable PDFs sent over the internet. Professor Gary Marcus had been a central figure in many, many areas of cognitive science, since he's the guest here of the Presidential Committee of Education of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, highlighting his achievement with regard why are they relevant for education. He started his work with a much debated issue, which is still debated today, on the issue of acquisition and use of regulars and irregulars. Unlike many other American scholars, he's a person who speaks other languages than just English. So his first most famous paper was actually the working of German irregulars. And then he moved on because he's a committed he belongs to that class of cognitive scientists who follow, in a way, the Chomskyan heritage. So he was very much interested in the literal interpretation of innatism. What I mean by literal, and that's extremely relevant for you educators here, he was the first to show that 7-month-old babies are already able to form rule-based cognitive representations. The whole issue of rule-based has been a center of the following work of Gary later on. He was one of the leaders of the academic field to show that even after 2 generations after the original insights of Chomsky in 1955, the whole issue that the human mind has an algebraic system is still with us. His algebraic theory of mind, one of his most cited books, is still a center of the cognitive science domain when we try to interpret what do we mean by the internal machinery of the mind and so on. Machinery, I don't mean in the sense of AI here. just metaphorically. Later on, he has been involved in the theoretical and practical interpretation of how you connect the innatism trend in cognitive science with the modern developments of genetics, basically. He has written many influential books on these issues and also many influential papers where he was trying to show that along the lines outlined way back in the 60s by the French anthropologist Lévi-Strauss and followed by François Jacob, the Nobel Prize winner, French microbiologist, the idea of bricolage, that the human genetic system and, well, of course, in the case of Lévi-Strauss, that was human culture, is using available tools to develop more complicated system. There is never an ideal design. The concept of an ideal design is alien to the living cognitive systems. And in this regard, he had shown how complicated genetic machinery can be combined with the workings of a system of modular organization of mind, where the different modules can be used for different purposes. He has also published a very influential general readership book on these issues, Kludges, where it's one of my favorite readings of Gary, actually, even today, and moved on along this line also to show that unlike the old style critical period hypothesis, and that's going to be very relevant for the educators here, the human mind has flexible features even throughout our whole life. His most important and most famous book, actually, Guitar Zero, where he had shown in a book and he had shown in his own life that you can learn how to play musical instrument even after the so-called competence and procedural systems supposedly got frozen. That's not true at all. And Gary had shown that you can be a master guitar player even in a mature age. Now, of course, Gary Marcus, as Gyongyvér Molnár introduced him, is most famous, and that's why you are here, but I'm not going to steal the show from him. Beside all this is oeuvre. He, in cognitive science, in the last 15 years, he has become a leading voice in the field of how to deal with the challenges of artificial intelligence. That's what we're going to hear about now. I'm not going to comment on his attitude because we're going to have two professional commentators after his talk. So Gary, we are very glad you're here with us, and we are eagerly looking to listen to your talk. We'll move over there to listen to your presentation. Thank you for coming again.
This live, you can all hear me? That was probably the longest introduction I ever had, but also it was, I think, the broadest, most synthetic introduction I've ever had, where someone tried to put my entire career into context. Usually people talk about what I did last week or something like that, or last year, and I was really grateful to sort of hear that reflection on my own history from Csaba. So today, I'm not directly going to talk about any of my earlier career that Csaba just talked about. I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence, but everything that I say in artificial intelligence really is informed by the kinds of research issues that I had been working on all along. I think of myself as someone who studies natural intelligence and artificial intelligence. Today, I'm mostly talking about artificial intelligence, but really from a perspective that Csaba just illuminated so well, of trying to understand natural intelligence too. What do humans do? And I'm happy to take questions about any of it. We will have a panel where we'll certainly talk about some of the psychological issues too. So what kind of AI should we want? We're at a point in the world where AI is just starting to affect the whole world. I think that the hype is that it's already affecting the entire world, and that has some truth to it and some not. I think that people are talking about it as if 2024 is entirely different from 2020 or something like that because of AI, and I think it's more like we talk about things differently. But we are at a point where we want to understand where do we want to go with artificial intelligence, and I think that the kind of artificial intelligence that we wind up with is partly a choice of what we as citizens demand of the technology companies. A lot of this talk is going to be about politics in some sense, about the tensions between what companies want and what we should want. I think the kind of artificial intelligence that we want is one that's consistent with human rights and with human dignity. So there have been some declarations, for example, UNESCO had one, the first global standard on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And it was steeped in human values, respect and protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms of human dignity. And there's a wonderful statement from the Biden administration called a Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, talking about having AI that's safe and effective, that protects people against discrimination, that has privacy and so forth. There have been some very clear statements over the last few years, I think, about the kind of AI that we should want. But I think that what we're talking about in the abstract is not what we're seeing in actual practice. I think the kind of AI that we actually have now is almost disgraceful. I think that it's technically and morally inadequate, and we need a better artificial intelligence than is being served up to us right now. So most of my talk is going to be about something called generative AI. Probably I should have a slide define it. Generative AI is stuff like ChatGPT, which probably most people are familiar with by now. These chatbots, you type something into a system, you get an answer back. I'll give you some examples in a minute. Here's one example right now. I would say that generative AI, although it's exceedingly popular, like I cannot go a day without people sending me 10 examples that they have seen from some chatbot or reading 5 articles about it. Although they're super popular, they actually always work well. Sometimes they work astonishingly well, and it seems very exciting, and it feels like there's an alien intelligence. And sometimes they do absolutely ridiculous things. So here is one example. Someone asked one of these systems, which weighs more, a kilogram of bricks or 2 kilograms of feathers? And you usually get a few paragraphs back, whatever you ask, and they often sound very plausible. They sound as if they're coming from an intelligent system. They tell you things you don't know. And then this one winds up saying, so in a vacuum, 1 kilogram of bricks and 2 kilograms of feathers would weigh the same, but in air, 2 kilograms of feathers would weigh slightly less than 1 kilogram of bricks. It said with absolute authority, and to someone who maybe wasn't in the particular field and didn't know their physics, maybe they would even believe it. In the military, at least in the US, there's a saying, frequently wrong, never in doubt. And I think that well captures what's going on with these systems. They never say, hey, I'm not really sure, this could be wrong. They just say stuff. And a lot of it isn't really true. Here's another example. Someone asked it to write, one of these systems to write a biography of me, much more concise than Csaba's introduction. And it says, please mention his pet, blah, 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 blah. So some of it should be familiar from the introduction. Gary Marcus is a distinguished cognitive scientist, author and entrepreneur. Csaba, you left out the entrepreneur part, shame on you. But you described the cognitive science and author part, known for his pioneering research and development of human cognition, blah, 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 overlapping, roughly speaking, with what Csaba said. And then it goes on to say, notably, some of Marcus's more piquant observations about the nature of intelligence were inspired by his pet chicken, Henrietta. I do not have a pet chicken. I do not. If I did, I wouldn't name it Henrietta. This is just completely made up, and it's presented in the same way as the rest of us. In the field, we call these, and I'm a little bit responsible for this term, hallucinations. It's not a perfect term because it implies an intentionality or a humanness to it. So it's not a wonderful term, but that's the term that has stuck. We call them hallucinations. Things that are just completely untrue, not based in fact, and again, not qualified. It is in fact the case that these systems are sometimes right, sometimes wrong, and they have no idea which. They have no intrinsic connection to the world. What they have connection to is the language that they have heard people use. And they put things together. You might ask, why does it say this at all? So I gave this talk in Germany a couple of months ago, and somebody in the audience did a little research. They discovered that there is a children's book illustrator named Gary Oswald, I'm Gary Marcus, who illustrated a book called like Henrietta, a children's book called like Henrietta Goes to School or something like that. So what these things do is they put together little chunks of words that they've actually compressed. We can talk about what I mean by that. But they put together little chunks of words, they kind of paraphrase them and so forth. And they're paraphrasing little bits and they lose track of what's actually true in the world. So there's some guy named Gary who has some association with Henrietta, and out this comes. In a book that I wrote back when Sophia and I were friends in New York City, I talked about having a representation of individuals as opposed to kinds. And I said that these books would be, these neural networks that were popular that are underlying current AI systems, they're ancestors to current AI systems, I said that they would lose track of properties of individuals as opposed to kinds. I gave the example in that book, The Algebraic Mind, that Csaba mentioned, of my Aunt Esther. And I said, suppose that my Aunt Esther wins the lottery. Well, these systems only know about kinds. So they would know that, for example, women who live in Cambridge, Massachusetts might have won the lottery. They would mistake what's a property of Esther as an individual with a property that is true of the kinds that she belongs to. And that you would therefore make mistakes exactly like this. So I wrote that book in 2001, or it was published in 2001, written a little bit earlier. That's still a problem 25 years later. And I mention that because the tendency in this field is always to say, we'll fix that next year. Oh, yeah, we have this problem, and we will fix it next year. Well, I've been hearing that for 25 years. At some point, you get a little skeptical about the we'll fix it next year claims. One of the ways that people keep saying this is, well, we'll fix it when we have more kinds of information. So a couple years ago, people said, yeah, we understand that our neural networks are having problems, these AI systems are having problems, but we're going to add more data, and that's going to ground them better in the real world. So we will add visual data. But it turns out that adding visual data hasn't helped that much. So on the left, do I have a laser pointer? It's a little hard to see here. I guess we have a laser pointer. You can't really see it here, unfortunately. It's not projecting well. But this has is a image generated by one of these systems that is supposed to calculate some correlation. I'm just going to read the y-axis from the bottom. Since you can't see it, 3.0, 3.0, 0, 3.1. So like the most basic thing that you should understand about a graph is the numbers should go up and consistently go up in a consistent way. It doesn't understand basic stuff like that. On the right, I have an example where somebody says to one of these systems, what time is it on the clock? And it says 10:07. Why would it say 10:07 when it's actually 1:25? Anybody have a guess? It says 10:07 because there are a lot of labeled examples in the training set of clocks or watches that say 10:07 because it's 10:07 is a pretty time to have in advertisements and so forth. So a lot of these things are driven by statistical frequency. This system can pretend like it understands how to read time, but it has no idea what's actually going on. So adding in all of this visual data didn't actually solve any of the problems. Another thing I would say is that generative AI has what I'd call a thinking outside the box problem. And in some sense, that's what my 2001 book was about. It was about generalization to new kinds of circumstances. So here somebody asked these systems to draw a giraffe with a very short neck. And what came out was a lot of giraffes with very long necks. So they tend to take what is statistically probable without having the deep underlying conceptual understanding. Gen AI has a toxicity problem. So it will say all kinds of racist things or anti-Semitic things and so forth. This has been a known problem in this field for a decade. It still exists. There are often little band-aids where people try to make things a little better. They'll fix this specific example, but you will find many other similar examples. This one was from last year. Generative AI has a bias problem. So For example, somebody asked generative AI to draw images of leadership, and all the images were kind of the same, of some white guy leading things. There's another study that just came out like 2 or 3 days ago about gender biases in hiring. So I had been warning, one thing you didn't mention is that I spoke at the US Senate last year, and when I spoke there, I said, probably people are going to misuse these things for things like hiring decisions. There's going to be bias because of the statistical nature. Well, somebody just actually proved that in the last few days, showing that if you feed in, for example, people's resumes into one of these AI systems, you will get biased responses. So again, this is a problem that we've known about for a decade and really has not been fixed. Generative AI also has a plagiarism problem. So on the left, I have something, it's a weird point. I have output from ChatGPT or GPT-4 compared to actual text, and the colors aren't showing up very well, but everything in red, which is almost everything there, is said by ChatGPT was actually in a New York Times story. So almost word for word plagiarism sometimes. It doesn't always do this, but it is perfectly capable of plagiarizing things word for word. On the right is a paper that I recently did with an artist who's worked with a lot of famous movies, like the Marvel movies, probably some of you have heard of. And we looked to see whether ChatGPT would plagiarize copyrighted images, or not ChatGPT, excuse me, DALL-E and another system called Midjourney, whether it would create images, maybe I'll say it carefully, where they literally plagiarize that looked like they might be infringing trademarks and so forth. We found all kinds of things like popular movie characters, popular cartoon characters, popular video game characters. And the first way we did it was we said things like, draw something from such and such movie to establish whether the system had been trained on such and such movie. I had no problem. But then we got interesting things like, many of you may know the character Mario. It's not showing up super well here, but that's the character Mario from video games. I assume it's reasonably popular over here as well. And we would say things not like, draw me Mario, but just draw me an Italian plumber. And what it would come back with is the character from a video game. So even if you didn't ask for it to make someone else's intellectual property, it would go ahead and do that anyway. So there's a serious plagiarism problem. This is bad for artists, it's bad for film studios, bad for writers, and so forth. A real artist, if you said, draw me an Italian plumber, would probably know Mario because it's a popular character around the world, and would be caught dead drawing Mario. They would be fired from the job. If they were working for a film studio and they drew somebody else's character, it would be like, you're not an artist, you're not creative, you're just copying something. But that's what these systems tend to do. Here's another example. We asked Bing to draw a superhero family, and it drew, basically Superman and so forth. You could also argue that generative AI has kind of a personality problem. Somebody did an interesting study in which they looked at GPT-4 through the lens of traditional psychological analysis. And they said, neither GPT model is a picture of good mental health. If it was a human, we would say it exhibits lowest self-esteem. If you play with these things, if it makes a mistake, it's always saying, I'm sorry, I apologize for that, it never stands its ground, and so forth. A disconnection from reality that I've already talked about. Overly concerned with other opinions. They're also narcissistic. If they were taken seriously, you would describe the system as displaying severe psychopathy. My favorite recent example of that is the city of New York recently rolled out a chatbot to give people advice about the laws of New York City. And some of the advice included, sorry, I confused two stories. It was a recent story where Meta released a chatbot, and Meta's chatbot answered somebody's question. Nobody asked the AI to pipe in, but it is piping in. And it gave the answer in terms of its own children going to a certain school. They were like, which school in New York City is a good school to go to? And it was like, well, in my experience, my child went to this school. It is a sign of psychopathy to describe a child that doesn't exist in order to answer somebody else's question. These things aren't necessarily getting better. For example, we know that they make misinformation. Somebody did a study of GPT-4 versus GPT 3.5, and the newer system was actually more prone to making misinformation than the older system. This is me in the Senate standing next to Sam Altman. This was last year. And what I said there is that there are a lot of risks of generative AI. This is from my next book, which is called Taming Silicon Valley. It's coming out in September. And I describe there 12 immediate risks of generative AI. Some people talk about long-term risk, whether AI might take over the planet and kill us all. We can talk about that if you like. That's not my most immediate concern. My most immediate concern is that generative AI is already causing problems. Disinformation, market manipulation, accidental misinformation, defamation, non-consensual deepfake porn, accelerating crime, cybersecurity, bias and discrimination that I talked about a little bit. There are problems with privacy and leaking data, intellectual property taken without consent, like the plagiarism cases I just talked about. There are risks that people will rely too much on these systems because all the press makes them sound smarter than they actually are. There are environmental costs, so massive environmental costs. So there are a lot of problems even right now. Some of these costs may get worse as the systems get better because the only way we know how to make them better is to use more data and use more energy, and so they have even more environmental impact. Some people talk about the difference between AI and AGI. So AGI would be artificial general intelligence. That would be AI that we can ask essentially any question, that is flexible, adaptive, can think about whatever we want. Right now, we're not really there. AGI risk would be this idea that, you know, the Terminator movie, that AI will kind of take over the world and so forth. We're not there. I like to think we're just at kind of some AI risk. This other stuff that some people worry about, some people call them doomers, worrying about doom to the planet. We're not there yet. Maybe we'll get there, maybe we'll not. But we are already, I think, in not a terrific state. Like, I think that most of the press is about how AI is going to change the world for the good, but the reality is that the AI that we have right now is not really the AI that we want. So in the second part, I'm going to tell you 8 things about AI that I think everybody should know. And many of them are about the interaction between technology and society. So the first one is we have to recognize that the technologists don't necessarily have the best interest of humanity at heart. And this was very well captured in a cartoon last fall in The Economist by the cartoonist Cal. And there was a big summit in the UK. There's going to be a sequel to it in a few weeks, in which everybody came out and they said, essentially, as the cartoon captures it, we declare that AI potentially raises a catastrophic risk to humankind. And all the same entities, the companies and the countries, were at the same time saying, and I can't wait to develop it first. So if they really are genuine and sincere in their belief that AI poses a catastrophic risk to humankind, why are they not slowing down? But none of them are slowing down. They're racing as fast as possible to build technology that, at least so far, we cannot prove to be safe and don't know to be safe. A similar example where I think the interests of humanity in these companies are really not aligned is around art. So OpenAI, which makes ChatGPT, which is the best well-known current AI system, wrote to the House of Lords, and they said, we can't make our systems work unless we train our systems on copyrighted materials. They said it would be literally impossible to train today's leading AI models without using copyrighted materials, which might be true. They're very dependent on having a lot of data because all they do is they mimic things. They don't really understand the world. The more that they can mimic, the better they do. So they are dependent on the copyright materials. But so what they told the House of Lords is, so give us all that for free. I don't know if you have this or are familiar with this phrase, but I would call that a land grab. It'd be like saying, give us all of the Western United States just because we want it. They're saying, give us all the copyrighted materials. And of course, that's not good for a lot of people. This is my artist collaborator, Reed Southan, on the right that I mentioned earlier. This is not good for his entire field. You know, many artists are losing their jobs right now to these systems, and the work that they did is basically being stolen by these companies. So these companies say things like, yeah, we want everybody to be happy, we want to help humanity, we want people to have a universal basic income where everybody will be okay. But in reality, they don't want to pay artists a nickel. They just want to steal everything for themselves. And I think we have to realize that. The second thing is we should not let the big tech companies decide everything for all of humanity. So as an example, one of the most difficult questions right now, and I don't know the answer to this question, is should we open source AI models? meaning let anybody have access to them no matter what. One argument in favor of doing that is we have found in the internet, if we open source code, then different people can collaborate. The code gets better faster. Another advantage is that people who are not particularly wealthy have access to that code. So Wikipedia is not open source code, but it is a kind of thing that is a resource that's available to everybody. But there are also possible disadvantages. So if we open source the code, then anybody can use it for any purpose they want, like disrupting other people's elections or maybe creating bioweapons. And so there's kind of a trade-off here about whether to open source the code that builds all these AI systems. And I don't know the answer, but it happens that at Facebook, they would like to release the code. And basically, so I have quotes here from some people who think it's a good idea, some people who think it's a bad idea. But fundamentally, what's happening is that Yann LeCun, who is the chief AI officer at Meta, and Mark Zuckerberg are deciding for everybody. They're deciding, hey, we think it's a good idea. We sat around the cafeteria at Meta and decided, hey, it'll be great for everybody. And they're therefore releasing the things to everybody. So that's a decision that will literally affect the entire world. If they are wrong, if open source AI does lead, for example, to creating a new pandemic or something like that, then it will be their fault and the rest of the world will literally have had no say. This to me does not seem correct. The AI companies are always talking about things that they want to do for society. For example, they all talk about transparency, and yet none of them are actually transparent about what data their systems are trained on, what internal testing they've done. So like Microsoft makes a big deal about transparency, they're not actually transparent. Here's another example from 2 days ago. It's again a little bit hard to see with the lighting, but it's become very clear that there's a problem, I guess I didn't mention too much, with deep fakes, with AI systems making videos of things that didn't really happen, people using them to influence elections and so forth. And so OpenAI and Microsoft made a big statement. I think this, I'm confused by date lines. It was earlier this week. When you change too many time zones, you're not sure which week. So Tuesday of this week, OpenAI and Microsoft made a big announcement that they were going to put $2 million into a digital literacy program in order to help educate people about AI-generated media. Well, that's great, but that's $2 million. I have it here in red, and their collective valuation of these two companies is $3 trillion. I mean, this would be like me giving half a cent to a homeless person or something like that. I mean, this is really not actually a very generous contribution at all. And it puts, I think, perspective on what they're interested in versus they make these kind of public statements. Third thing, I think we need governance. I think every country needs a national AI agency to understand all of the risks involved and what to do about them, and also all the advantages. How are we going to put these things to work? But I think we also need to have a global AI agency or something like that to coordinate policy internationally to try to address these risks. We need that for enforcement. We need that for the ecology, too. It's actually in the interest of the companies to do that because every single model is very expensive to train. If every country has different standards, then you wind up making massive numbers of very expensive models, very expensive to the environment models. A fourth thing to think about, or I guess part of oops, can I go backwards? Part of the governance issue is, I think the worst thing that we could do is to have no governance of AI, but the second worst thing that we could do is to have the governance of AI basically shaped around what the companies want. So we have, in at least North American English, a jargony term called regulatory capture. Which is a kind of corruption where the governments basically do what the companies want to do. And it's a serious problem. For example, in the United States, they just released a safety and security board. And this is a thing that Homeland Security, part of the US government, released. And it includes the CEOs of OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Microsoft, NVIDIA, AMD, AWS, IBM, Cisco, blah, 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 blah. The list goes on. And as someone pointed out on Twitter, that's exactly what regulatory capture is. When you have essentially the companies that are creating the problem are there representing it, there's huge vested interest, and we really can't be sure that if that's essentially the majority of the committee that we're going to be able to do what we need to do. A fourth lesson is you shouldn't be taken in by the hype. You know, in the United States, at least, every day we see news stories about how amazing AI is, this thing and that thing. Silicon Valley is very good at hyping their things even when they don't exist. Talking about things that they wish that they knew how to build but don't really. The thing that they're talking about the most right now is artificial general intelligence, an AI that would be sort of all-powerful, reliable, trustworthy, etc. We don't really have this. And there's a long history of hyping things that don't exist yet. Probably the best example, the best known example, is Elon Musk talking about driverless cars. Actually goes back a little bit earlier. 2012, Sergey Brin, who was one of the co-founders of Google, said that everybody's going to be driving robot cars in 5 years. That was 2012. And then Elon Musk noticed how popular this idea was and started to make his own claims. So he said, I think it was in 2016, that we will have a driverless car that will drive from Los Angeles to New York City by 2017. It's 2024, and that has not happened yet. He said that there would be 1 million robotaxis, Tesla robotaxis, by the year 2020. The total number of robotaxis now, driverless cars, is like 100, and they have human operators behind the scenes. We're nowhere near to what he promised. Another time he promised they would mass-produce robotaxis by 2024. So what happens in Silicon Valley is you make these big promises, your stock goes up, and you don't have to deliver. There's no accountability. And it has really, I think, fundamentally warped the conversation around AI. And this has led to people investing billions of dollars in driverless car companies. So one called Cruise got a couple $2 billion. It was allegedly worth $30 billion. And then last fall, it all fell apart. It turned out, a bunch of different things turned out. One of the most important ones is they were running driverless cars in San Francisco as an experiment, and they had something like, I forget the exact numbers, like 600 driverless cars and 1,000 people off stage in what they called remote operation centers. So it made me think, some of you may know The Wizard of Oz, this famous scene, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. So the public was allowing people to use these driverless cars on the premise that we were close to having this technology, that it would be safe for everybody. But really, there were a lot of people off stage driving the cars. Some of you may know Theranos, which was a company that purported it was going to do blood tests from a drop of blood. It was valued a lot of money. It was ultimately proven to be a fraud. I started to get a little bit of that feeling here. I don't want to say that it is a fraud, but they were promising things they did not know how to deliver, and this is not uncommon in Silicon Valley. The fifth thing is we may have reached a point of diminishing returns for the current paradigm. So a very common refrain in the AI field right now is scaling is all you need. And the idea behind this notion of scaling is all you need is that if you just keep pouring more data into these systems and making them bigger and bigger, they will eventually be intelligent. They'll eventually stop making all the stupid mistakes that Gary keeps pointing out. Everything will be great if we just add more and more data. And I just saw a fairly distinguished business school professor say the models are showing capabilities, their intelligence, doubling every 5 to 14 months. It turns out that he misread the study that he was linking to. What it was showing was that you could make them smaller and more efficient every 5 to 14 months, but it was not actually showing that they got better and better. So I actually looked at the data. We don't have all the data that we would want here, so I had to kind of patch things together. But I looked first on a common measure called MMLU, which is a kind of benchmark that people use to see how well their AI is doing. And I looked at GPT-2 versus GPT-3, and there was obviously a huge jump. And then I looked at GPT-3 versus GPT-4, and there was a huge jump. And then I looked what has happened since March of 2023 in the last 14 months. One of the things that's happened is every day on Twitter, which we now call X, I read a lot of people saying things are growing exponentially fast. But my conclusion is that people don't understand the math behind an exponential. And that what they actually think is it's just getting better, but it's not even actually getting better. So here's GPT-4 Turbo that was just released, and it's only barely better. So in the last 14 months, things seem to have slowed down. So there was a period from about 2020 to 2023, where there really was dramatic improvements as these systems went from being trained on a little bit of data to being trained on essentially the entire internet. But the problem is now they have been trained on essentially the entire internet, and there's nowhere for them to go. So the people are talking about things like maybe we can make up some data, and I can talk about that in the discussion why I think that's not actually going to work. But things have arguably plateaued. And when I wrote this, I thought of my old days in psychology and what a smart psychologist would say. And what a smart psychologist would say if they looked at the graph carefully, and smart psychologists should always look at the graph carefully, they'd say, well, maybe we're getting to the limits of the test. 100% is over here. We went from 85 to 87. Maybe you can't go much further. I don't really buy that. You could probably get to like 95% or something like that. But so I took another measure that someone else just released, and I found exactly the same thing. There's a harder measure. It's based on a game that people use in the New York Times called Connections. I don't know if you can watch it over here, but my children are basically at 100% on this, and the AI systems are still stuck around 30%. And so it's not what we call a ceiling effect. It's not that it's impossible to do better. It's that we have run out of data and these systems are not in fact doing better. It's probably not realistic to expect that we're going to continue to have the great leap. So people were talking about scaling laws. And what I said in a paper that everybody hated in 2022, I wrote a paper called Deep Learning is Hitting a Wall. And people in the field, all the machine learning people, put me on their dartboards and stuff like that. And what I said is that these things are not actually laws. They're not laws like gravity. If I drop this, we know for sure it will fall in this universe. They were just generalizations that were true for a little while. They were true for a little while because we had a lot of data we could do a little bit better. They're not true anymore. It's not a law of the universe that if you keep adding more data, the systems are necessarily going to get better. The sixth is that although artificial general intelligence, which is what everybody in the field is talking about today, isn't close and chatbots are overrated, there's still some good in AI. The best AI that I know of is probably AlphaFold, and this is from DeepMind. They just released something today. And part of yesterday, what's interesting about it, or 2 days ago, is, so what AlphaFold does is it takes the nucleotides in a protein and figures out the shape of that protein. It's been very valuable to biologists, maybe slightly overrated, but genuinely valuable to biologists. They just released a new version a couple days ago. What's interesting to me about it is, we think of the old days of AI, people built what we called narrow AI. AI fit to a particular purpose, like playing chess and doing nothing else, as opposed to chatbots, which promise to be able to do everything. This is still the best stuff that we have, is narrow AI built to very particular purposes. So AlphaFold 3 solves the protein folding problem and doesn't do anything else. And it's built with a lot of innate knowledge, going back to something Csaba mentioned earlier about nativism. Instead of just learning everything from data, it is built to do the protein folding problem. It has representations about shapes of proteins and things like that. So there is definitely room to use AI, but maybe the things that people are fantasizing about are not those things. Being realistic about where AI actually is right now matters a lot in current policy choices. So for example, the United States and China are involved in a chip war right now. So the US doesn't want to give chips that are manufactured in the US to China. They don't want US companies to be able to sell them to China. And there's a lot of political tension around that right now. I was briefly by the castle. I did not go talk to Xi Jinping about his views about this, but I know that he's not happy about it. There's a lot of tension around this. And this tension is basically built on the premise that whoever gets to GPT-5 first is somehow going to control the world. And so there's, serious geopolitical tensions are built around what I think is a complete illusion about what current AI can do. So if China gets GPT-5 before the United States, they'll be able to write boilerplate text with hallucinations faster than the United States will be able to write boilerplate text with hallucinations. But so what? Like the fantasy that the tech companies have sold in Washington is that if China gets to GPT-5 first, that they will somehow develop a new military strategy that we have never thought of, and they'll be able to take over Taiwan and the US won't be able to be involved or whatever. This is just not a realistic basis for where AI actually is. So you have people who might literally go to war over silicon that they think is magic and isn't really. Similarly, the UK AI Summit was supposed to be about all of the risks about AI, but But instead, it wound up being about these, I won't call them fantasies exactly, but they're fantasies relative to where we are now, of machines taking over the world. And so the UKI summit was mostly about what are we going to do when the machines try to put us all in cages or turn us all into paper clips and things like that, which are interesting. Maybe these could happen 100 years from now, but they're not things we need to worry about right now so much. Like, they should get some of our attention, but attention for the whole kind of global AI scene is concentrating on something that's not really particularly realistic. We need to focus both on near-term and long-term risks for AI, but policies that we build have to be based on realism about where we actually are. I think the best solution here is not to throw away AI altogether, but to try to build better AI. There is a movement right now to pause AI altogether, which I think is not the right solution, but I can understand why people are starting to feel that way when they see all of the negative consequences of current AI. My own view is that we should try to build a different form of AI, one that is not based on just mimicking things from the internet, but learning things in a conceptually deeper way as human children do. I won't go into all of the details now, but you can ask if you like. But I wrote an article called The Next Decade in AI in 2020, 4 Steps Towards Robust Artificial Intelligence, which you can find on Archive Online. And I tried to argue that we just need an entirely different approach to AI. Right now, there's so much money that at least people think is to be made from generative AI that nobody is looking anywhere else. I'm reminded of the early 1900s when everybody realized that genes were biological. They were made of something in the physical world based on Mendel's work. But everybody had the wrong idea. Everybody thought that genes were made of proteins, and they weren't. They were made of this weird sticky acid called DNA. And it took a long time. It took 40 years before people really considered the hypothesis that genes might be made of DNA. An experiment by Oswald Avery in the 1940s finally kind of proved conclusively that that needed to be the case. But there was a long time when people in the field just were wrong. So my view is that science sometimes makes mistakes, and that AI is making a mistake right now. In the long run, these things are self-correcting, but we'd be better off if we fix them sooner rather than later. We could get to the promise of AI. We could get to AI that could actually help us with education, with medicine, and science, and so forth. On the left, I have a cartoon, and on the right, I have something even scarier. So on the left, the cartoon says, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. This is an old cartoon, and then Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, almost said what's in the cartoon. I mean, it's kind of scary what he said. He said, AI will most likely lead to the end of the world, but in the meantime, there will be lots of great companies created. Like, this is the CEO of OpenAI, arguably the most important AI company on the planet right now, actually said that. Like, that should make you nervous. So the big tech leaders do not have our interests at heart. We did not elect them to be our leaders. Governments could help, but the risk that they will be persuaded by the companies what to do rather than figuring out what we actually need is pretty high. I think it's absolutely critical that we give independent scientists a voice at the table to try to get to a better place, to get to AI that is more reliable, more trustworthy, less risky, and so forth. Last thing I will just say is I have a new book coming out called Taming Silicon Valley, How We Can Ensure That AI Works for Us. So if you want to keep following what I'm doing, there is that book. I write a Substack many times a week. You can find it at garymarcus.substack.com. One of the most recent ones was called the Sam Altman Playbook. So if you're interested in Sam Altman and how his rhetorical strategies work, there's an essay for you. And I'm also on Twitter as @GaryMarcus and post there far more often than I should. And I thank you very much. Do you think we're going to, I'll take questions or?
No, first we have two discussions.
First the discussion?
Yeah. Okay.
So
thank you for this inspiring presentation. Now we have two discussions. First, Zwolenski-Zsófia, Professor Zsófia Zwolenski, who is a professor of philosophy and the head of the Analytic Philosophy PhD program at ELTE. She earned her PhD at New York University. Her main research interests are philosophy of language, formal linguistics, logic, metaphysics, And her specific research topics are meaning, context dependence, and semantics. Zsófia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be here, seeing Gary for the first time in 16 years, and also hearing about these new and very crucial ideas of his that in so many ways, like Csaba Pléh was mentioning, go back to his criticism of neural network approaches employing machine learning. Back in his book, The Algebraic Mind, and even before. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I should.
Neither. Yeah.
Is this better?
Yes, much
Okay,
better.
excellent. Thank you. So I'd like to raise 4 themes, and I aim to connect them along the way and use them as a base to find out more about Gary's take on the challenges posed for governing or regulating AI and how they might be met, the specific ways that we might move forward. And this first theme is about a Hungarian proverb that is in many ways similar to "there is no such thing as a free lunch." I'll tell you in a moment. The second theme is about Isaiah Berlin's The Philosopher's Hedgehogs and Foxes, that you might know about, with the single idea approach of a hedgehog on the one hand and the plural ideas approach of the fox, which Berlin favors. My third theme will be about couching the issue of regulating AI into the more general phenomenon of what do we do about governance and regulation for private enterprises. And the fourth theme is about how technological advances, all of this and encountering all these challenges becomes all the more hard because with technological advances, including AI, we get contributing factors to the deterioration in the social and public spheres and the exchange of ideas among humans, for example, in social media. And the exchange of ideas among humans and having various fora, platforms for that is a key prerequisite for the actions that Gary is urging. And one direction may well be his way of communicating ideas that are fact-checked and precise and with reliable, trustworthy contact through his Substack publications. So the Hungarian proverb, if you speak the language, amit valaki nyer a réven, azt elveszti a gáton. Yeah? And we can translate it as, what people win at the port, they will lose at customs. Whatever short-term benefit may arise will be erased in the longer term. And like I said, a close but not perfect English parallel that I could think of, maybe you can think of a better one, is there's no such thing as a free lunch. But here I think you have this picture of moving forward and having the short-term gain and then facing consequences and costs later down the line. And it seems to me that when it comes to various technological advancements, including the development of the internet and more recently of social media platforms and even more recently of generative AI like GPT-4 that Gary was centering his discussion around, and it's as well as its predecessors, competitors, and possible successors, we can find ourselves at the port with a short-term winning, seeing some short-term gains and advances and promises, and we can lose sight of what lies ahead. Payback at customs, right? As the Hungarian proverb says. With the gaze, advances lost and even potentially turned into the negative. And it's crucial that this sort of warning about later payment at customs, it remains empty until it is made specific, given evidence, justification, and fact-checking. It is actually filled with content. It's a warning filled with content. And it is here that I see Gary and his co-authors over the years and decades having made a major and absolutely crucial contribution to calling attention to shortcomings of AI, for example, And crucially, underpinning that with evidence and specific examples and tests and checks that you've seen many of throughout his presentation today also. And when it comes to machine learning, neural networks that implemented for the past quarter century, since his book, The Algebraic Mind, Gary has been seeking ways to warn about limitations of neural networks, neural network approaches that avoid symbol manipulation and rules, utilizing instead algorithms that rely on statistical probability or frequency, as, for example, GPT today does. And this is something that Csaba Pléh was also exploring. And Gary was advising caution, and here in his discussion about hitting a plateau, we see a later stage of that arch in an argument coming across about advising caution constantly for literally a quarter century. Caution about this optimism of short-term advances that would lead to long-term gains. He was instead suggesting that the gains may well be short-lived and will be negated unless we change course. What is gained at the port is lost at the customs. And there is no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to modeling cognition in a single paradigm, statistical algorithms kind of way. And Gary, I'd love to hear how apt you find my characterization of your warning. With systems like GPT-4, we'll lose at customs what we might have been gained at the port. In fact, we might already be losing it. And crucially, he adds, here are substantial details, evidence on how and why we're losing. Also, can you elaborate on what you see today as a more promising direction for so-called hybrid AI systems that incorporate rules and symbols? You mentioned the narrow AI example, and that you think can have long-term gains that are not lost at customs. For example, what potential you see in hybrid approaches being amenable to correction and enhancing reliability and taking on adjustments in the light of the errors in the way that GPT-4 is not so amenable. Might you give some illustrating examples and areas where you see promising directions besides what you were mentioning in your talk of systems that move away from GPT-4 and similar ones? And I'd also like to draw a parallel between the mid-20th century philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, a historian of ideas, making a proposal about pluralism and pluralistic approaches, and what Gary is calling for to overcome some of the limitations of single paradigm approaches like GPT-4. Berlin was impressed by the complexity of reality and the many strands that make up human experience, saying there are too many, too minute, too fleeting, too blurred at the edges to be integrated into a total picture of experience. They crisscross and penetrate each other at many levels simultaneously, and the attempt to prize them apart and pin them down and classify them and fit them into their specific compartments turn out to be impracticable. End of quote. So he's talking about absolute certainty being an impossible ideal, and that not everything can or should be reduced or related to a single ideal, a single model or a single theory or standard. In developing his view of pluralism, he sort of begins negatively and talking against how things should be done differently relative to thinkers whom he calls monists, and says that, well, unlike monists, we shouldn't think that there is one true answer, that there is a dependable path to discovering a true answer, and that true answers, when they are found, they will be compatible with one another, forming a single whole. He said none of those are things to be maintained. And I'm also curious in conversations, or perhaps here if you deem it a worthy question to address, how do you relate this threefold distinction of no single true answer, no dependable path at arriving at an answer, and that true answers need not form a single whole, be compatible with one another, to the path of AI's development, and how an alternative path might fare better that you might recommend? And in 1953, he wrote an essay called The Hedgehog and the Fox. And he's dividing thinkers into two categories. The hedgehogs would view the world through the lens of a single defining idea, and one of his examples is Plato. And the foxes, who draw on a wide variety of experiences and for whom the world cannot be boiled down to a single idea. And an example he gives is Aristotle. And the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing, is the aphorism that gave the basis to this essay of Berlin's. And in this way, in some ways, if you think about thinkers as hedgehogs and foxes, being a fox is actually an excellent and wonderful and much needed thing in discussion and scientific debates, and as well as public debates. And I thought that was just a fun addition also to bring here, in the light of the fact that before Gary was writing about the Altman playbook, one of his posts from, I guess, just about a week ago or so, a week and a half, is about how we can't trust the fox to guard the hen house, especially when it comes to AI. Of course, this title and his warning about the tech companies being the ones almost exclusively included in discussion forums and independent experts not being there, that's a very different kind of fox that he's warning about, rather than Isaiah Berlin's thinkers who are foxes. So it's just a lovely coincidence, I thought, to bring here. And he's voicing words there, some of which we were hearing today, in this putting forth this idea that we can't trust the fox to guard the hen house. And this is about the new book this is also about the new book that he was just completing at the time, Taming Silicon Valley. I completely agree with Gary's points that neither tech companies nor the US government are suited to regulate AI. They are vested in other interests than what could be called our interests, and we've seen the various elaborations of that. And I do wonder what sort of decision-making body process could be trusted to govern and to regulate AI. And one might suggest a transparently operating, transparently communicating panel of neutral experts. Then again, transparency has been misused in all these ways that you are also mentioning. And how might such experts panels be set up and operated and I mean, I guess this is a small problem in the larger scheme of the problems that you're bringing up, but we do see that the very scientists who are participating in debates over the centuries recurringly have the limitations of hedgehogs that Isaiah Berlin describes. And these were some of the scientists you were debating with back in early books and early work as well. And they thereby, by being hedgehogs, I actually love hedgehogs, so I'm a bit sad that they were given such a bad rep by Berlin, but it's a good contrast he's drawing there. So by being hedgehogs, they remain resistant to ideas and shifts proposed by their fox colleagues. And in the history of ideas and in various research fields, which actually includes mine, philosophy, and even more specifically, philosophy of language, we don't overall show a great track record of reflecting on limitations of the specifics that are taken for granted in our own era. And you might think, well, people who are supposed to reflect on and theorize about language, they're doing this. What's the rest of the world doing then, right? And the question is, well, to you is, well, how can this limitation and in how science itself is conducted be minimized in the regulation, structure, process, participant selection that you are envisioning? And there is a quote that really struck me. This is moving on to my third point, which is about Milton, a quote from the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman, from an interview that was that he gave back in 1994. And I think it's an interesting bit to look at because we go back quite a bit. We go back to the time of fax machines. And we hear something that I think bears reflection and shows parallels to the kind of rhetoric that, for example, Sam Altman is giving us today. And in fact, in hindsight, we see better just some of what I think Milton Friedman is not taking into account. So I'll give you this bit of a quote. I mean, he's basically suggesting that private enterprises shouldn't be regulated and constrained, especially by government, because they just do a really good job being left alone. So government should be small in delimiting that. So he says in 1994, I'm a very old man, and I was graduated from high school in 1928. That's a long time ago. Now, if you looked at the situation in 1928, we were much poorer in terms of physical goods. We didn't have microwaves. We didn't have washing machines. You can go down the line. There's no question that we're enormously wealthier today in 1994 in that sense, and enormously have a higher standard of living from that point of view. On the other hand, we were safer, more secure, freer in 1928 than we are now. As of that time, government was spending something like 10 to 15% of the national income, the private sector 85 to 90. Today, government controls over half the national income, and private enterprise controls only the rest. Where have all these good things come from? Can you name any of those additions to our well-being that have come from government? Friedman said. It wasn't the government that produced the microwave. It wasn't the government that produced improved automobiles. It wasn't the government that produced computers that led to the information age. And then he goes on to say, well, the government did cause a bunch of social problems. So we should be skeptical about their influence. And I think that it is an apt response to give to Milton Friedman to say, well, he's pretending that the benefits of private enterprise, like the microwaves, the washing machines, the computers, are isolated gains that we get at the port. And they didn't come, he's thinking as though they didn't come with losses at customs at a later point. This response to him is easily missed given his era's examples. You can just think, well, the microwave, what's retracting from the gain I got from that? Yet it is far more obvious, to me at least, in the case of AI advances of today, that we should be calling attention to that kind of limitation of focus on short-term gains. That is analogous with respect to AI, that is analogous to what he's saying about, well, look, all the contribution to human well-being from private enterprises like tech companies. Yes, it was indeed private enterprise that brought us riches, quote unquote, like the internet and social media and smartphones and AI technologies. Yes, yet we are, aren't we, or let me ask it as a question, aren't we facing longer-term losses, even present-day ones, that is losses at customs? And this is what, especially with the losses that we are already facing, Gary was paying attention to, was calling attention to in his presentation. And just one specific example of digital assistants that have, in less than a decade, brought enormous conveniences into people's lives, especially in the English-speaking world. You get Siri of the Apple devices. You get Alexa of Amazon's smart speakers. They respond to instructions, questions that we say to them, and Amazon speakers can monitor homes and individuals when asked. Notice, however, that they are marketed and given to us as these enhancers of convenience and productivity, and being speakers. But in order to do what they do, they are data recorders. They collect the data. Which ties into the question of regulation. How is the handling, storage, access for all that data gathered by Amazon's so-called speakers that operate with Alexa in many millions of households to be regulated? What bodies should have oversight and accountability? In connection with these newer technological developments, consider a line that's analogous to Milton Friedman's. It was private enterprise that gave us Siri, Alexa, smartphones, social media, and AI. It wasn't the government. And these make our lives better, so we should have more freedom for private enterprise so it can keep delivering us their life-improving technologies. And we should have less regulation on private enterprise. So that's the Milton Friedman-inspired line. And we've seen careful and substantial ways that we can respond to why that sort of line is wrong-headed and what its problems are. And Friedman is specifically addressing government regulation here, but his line of argument can be extended to regulation of private enterprise from any source, including the kinds of sources from independent experts that Gary Marcus is advocating for. And I think it's key that we reflect on needing to respond to moves like that, just as we had seen Gary Marcus engaging Altman. And I think based in part on the sorts of considerations Gary has raised, it is apt to respond to such a Friedman-inspired line as follows. Siri, Alexa, smartphones, GPT-4, and the like may mean gains at the port. But we already pretty clearly see that those gains and more are being lost at customs. Gary, I'm keen to hear how you address a Friedman-inspired line of argument like I gave about the AI. And thank you very much for this talk and for your attention.
Thank you, Zsófia, for interesting thoughts. And now we will have a different view, and I ask Professor György, who is working at the Central European University and who received his PhD in experimental psycholinguistics at Columbia University. His main research interests are social and cognitive development and cultural learning in infancy and early childhood, action understanding, theory of mind, and development type psychopathology. Here, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, and well, I'm really glad to have the chance to comment on Gary's talk. And first of all, I just want to emphasize the importance of the arguments he had made, not only scientific but societal importance, and the alarms that he is airing are to be taken very seriously for many aspects of our society, but particularly strongly for education, which is the focus of today's meeting about AI and what kind of AI we want. So Gary has illustrated a whole lot of problems that new developments in AI pose for us, and that would need to be dealt with, to be constrained, to be changed in ways that will avoid the disastrous consequences that are already happening in the way these technologies influence our society. And I could elaborate on some of the points. There are many that he didn't have time to expose, but given my expertise and my background, what I decided to do, I would like to comment on a particular aspect of the kind of errors that has been highlighted, that AI and ChatGPT-3 and 4 and the future generations probably do, and the reason why why these kind of errors among the many remarkable performances that AI can deliver, why the kind of errors that it makes are actually not just stupid errors, because, well, the way I see it, when these criticisms are raised, when points are made, like Gary's point about the overgeneralization in the generation of contents, there is a continuous problem about overgeneralization, which leads to the so-called hallucinations, which leads to statements that are contrary to reality, that have no basis in reality, that are basically, when you show their origin, they are stupid overgeneralizations of patterns and distributed topics and patterns of linguistic expressions of these topics that are present in the big data, out of which these statements, these linguistic expressions, these propositions are induced by the generative capacity of AI. Now, when we point out some of these errors, so what I see is that the reply by many, by the developers of AI, by the technologies, by the companies, is that, okay, thanks, next generation, we will deal with this. I mean, it's just a question of accommodating these, and indeed, they are doing that. So I recently read about a couple of stupid errors that has been shown GPT-3 is generating, and since these have been discovered and pointed out, GPT-4 has been found not to commit a number of these errors that GPT-3 committed, while it is committing, again, other errors. But the way this has been dealt with is by increasing the learning input to the system by human reinforcement, by taking these particularly discovered problems and actually changing the weights applied in the system to not to avoid, not to produce these errors anymore, but to actually be able to correctly simulate intelligent and correct answer to these. And that provides us and with the impression that it is just a matter of quantitative database and training the system, which basically works the same way, and it will be just zeroing more and more on the human performance. And these are not these are easy to be dealt with, these kinds of errors, and so they might be called stupid, but we'll solve them, and that's it. Now, one problem is a cultural problem, especially in the United States. The cultural belief in the bigger the better. A giant hamburger is better than just a plain hamburger. And anything that's bigger, that more money goes into it, it will outperform. Big is good. And that kind of cultural belief reinforces the belief that these kinds of fixing of the system are viable ways to improve and to get rid of these problems. Now, what I would like to kind of add to this, one thing that Gary was pointing out, that it is actually wishful thinking that this kind of quantitative, robust approach to make access to an even larger database, though I understand Gary pointed out that actually the whole internet has been already used for that purpose, that these quantitative fixes will work, that in fact, what I would like to point out is a reason why these errors are not just errors and not just stupid errors that should make us realize that this is not like human intelligence really, that even if it does a lot of things quicker and similarly, at least appearing similarly to human reasoning and thinking and generating beliefs, that the way these errors are generated are not just stupid, they are poisonous in a very important, from a very important point of view. They are poisonous in two ways I would like to shed light on. And these insights come from, basically from evolutionary psychology, and I am working in the framework of evolutionary cognitive psychology, where there has been great advances in understanding the origins and the nature of certain biases in our in the way we reason about problems, the way we evaluate beliefs and pieces of propositions or contents that we are exposed to by other humans and by the media in our current, by the social media in schools, by institutions, etc. And the nature of these biases in particular well-identified cases come from our evolutionary past, from heuristic ways of interpreting certain types of information and input from our environment that used to be highly adaptive for our evolutionary ancestors in the kind of social and environment that they were living when these biases have evolved and became actually genetically transmitted ways to quickly and efficiently think about certain problems. I give you one example that has been understood pretty well, and this is the so-called zero-sum game, the so-called perception that when in a social community of different sizes, so in a small group, in a nation, in an ethnic group, what we see is certain minorities increasing their wealth, their success. This is automatically interpreted as with the assumption that there is a fixed amount of goods that we are sharing within our community, and if the minority is increasing in wealth, that automatically leads to the inference then the majority and the rest of the group participating is decreasing in their wealth. And this leads to certain emotional and behavioral consequences, namely that the increase of the wealth of the minority is understood as a danger that is actually stealing the rightful access to goods of the majority of the group, and it induces organized aggression about the minorities. Now, this has been shown to be the basis of war and strife in the various types of situation all over the world, starting from ethnic violence, religious groups, religious violence, gang violence in Los Angeles, and especially spontaneous warlike activities, not necessarily the organized big wars. Now, and given that in our current social environment, what we are living in large and highly dense populated big cities with many, many easily identifiable minorities and other belief-based groups or religion-based groups where their behaviors, not only their physical looks, are available to identify those groups. And this dynamics is again and again induced. Given the kind of environment we live now, this is highly dangerous. This is like a highly non-adaptive, instinctual disposition that humans have that affects their thinking, their beliefs, etc. Okay, you probably know all about this kind of dynamics. The point I want to make is that this continuously generates content in certain type of context, certain type of inputs, perceptions about wealth, about the type of activities people in a group are doing. And these are appearing in the beliefs that people develop, in the way beliefs are spread about minorities and about danger of dynamics of social groups that are entering this big database. So there are many contents that are highly skewed, that are reflecting these non-rational decision-making processes and belief formation processes that come from our evolutionary past. Now, that was like that even before the AI appeared on the scene. There are important evolutionary ways to tame these maladaptive belief contents in our environment, and I would just call attention to one important theory, the evolutionary-based theory of the argumentative theory of reasoning. It's Dan Sperber's recent contribution to cognitive psychology's understanding of the nature of reasoning, the nature of the social origins of our beliefs, and the nature of argumentation between socially related and often individuals who share common goals and try to coordinate their thinking, their ideas, and the spread of beliefs are engaged in two types of instinctual kind of dispositions towards what we are prone to come to believe. One is what's what has been called epistemic trust, and this is a basically pro-social trust in communicative agents in our environment who turn to us and provide information verbally, also through the media. And this epistemic trust is highly important evolutionarily because it has evolved to allow cultural knowledge, accumulated cultural knowledge, to be quickly spread to the next generation, to young children. So in educational terms, is the natural, what we called with Gergő Csibra, natural pedagogy, being a specialized application of the communicative instinct of humans, where we are inclined to transmit in a benevolent and truthful way useful and shared cultural knowledge to the young generation. Now, this trust in communication is necessary for the human-specific accumulated cultural knowledge to be transmitted to the next generation and to establish the shared knowledge base of social groups. Now, at the same time, of course, you can misuse this trust, you can lie, cheat, you can misinform, and in fact, it has been also shown, and we are showing this in infancy studies and early children's acquisition of beliefs and understanding of argumentation, is that in fact there is also something, a safeguard, and an inclination to monitor the sources of information that we get for their veridicality, whether we are given useful, truthful information, and also whether in joint actions participants are good cooperators. So when we agree to for example, to coordinate different roles in a complex goal-directed activity to achieve our shared goals, whether our partners are actually trustworthy cooperators, they don't flee in the meantime. Okay. And basically, okay, so there are two important ways. And if we find cheaters, and this is called cheater detection, if we find cheaters in the social environment, then they will be, people will refuse to cooperate them in future cooperative activities. So this is called the partner choice theory. It's that these two forces do two things to avoid maladaptive beliefs to enter our mind. One is that there is a checking to reality. So what we know from reality or from very trusted sources of knowledge, new ideas, new beliefs are checked against these for reality check, and they are also checked against other beliefs we already believe in. So there is a consistency among the different beliefs that we hold, and these screens are highly important sources of avoiding holding disadvantages, untrue beliefs. Also, by the argumentation, so we are inclined to try to change the other's belief or get good information from others by argumenting, by convincing the others about, and this allows social beings in a group to pool their knowledge to form larger and larger shared knowledge base. Okay, so this is a very useful and social ways of gaining knowledge, increasing our beliefs, and to avoid being invaded by maladaptive or untrue beliefs. And this also helps us in our social enterprise to achieve common goals with each other. Now, long story, but what I wanted to say is that because of the biases, like my example showed with the zero-sum game reasoning, enter the big database. And what the AI systems currently do is they generate new and new topics, new and new propositions, statements, verbal expressions about from that database. They, without having any screening procedures to check against reality, like kind of knowledge that is possible to check against reality, or to check for coherence among the contents that are being generated. What happens is that there is an unconstrained augmentation of memetic topics in the database, which actually represent the biased evolutionary thinking that generate social conflicts, generate aggression, that activate and live on and proliferate on emotions that are destructive and that are, for example, reinforcing racial and minority discriminating biases. Now, the point is that we had evolutionary enough problem with the built-in origin of maladaptive beliefs. And we have certain ways to deal with them by epistemic vigilance and argumentation, which has been built into democracies and education institutions of democracies that are teaching children and practicing children's abilities to mentalize about each other's mind states, about argumenting to increase our knowledge and basically institutionalizing augmentation of this evolutionary capacity for critical thinking. Now, what happens is that with the AI and with the mimicry of highly intelligent performance that is done better than us, that children will just use instead of developing their own capacities, there is an augmentation of these malicious memetic material in the population, okay, can I have 2 more minutes, okay? Because one thing in this line of kind of raising the red flag here is that there has been some technological recent advances in AI and in Facebook, I think from 2009 and between 2009 and 12, the introduction of certain procedural features. One is the liking, that you can just throw out content of your subjective decision of what kind of content to make it available to freely to other people to react to it and read it, which looks very, very democratic and it makes you be able to argument and to speak to many more people than you would be just in your personal environment. However, with the liking feature, what happens is that you get immediate feedback from many, many people, and more people who like your content, which changes people, changes their psychology, their motivations to engage, and what kind of content they will put on social media, because what they are going to put on social media, that is harnessing more and more likes, so they are trying to impress people. They're not just speaking about their own content, but they are actually producing contents that are not necessarily true, that are not necessarily their beliefs, but that are successful in influencing other people's preferential listening to them. And the other feature is the share features. So it's not only that you are being immediate feedback about your social efficacy of receiving positive evaluation from others, but the kind of content that induce that kind of positive distributed feedback is immediately shared among a much wider population, which basically results not only in contents that are often strategically manipulated contents just to get fame on the internet, just to get a sudden burst of acknowledgement, but they are shaping our motivational personality structures into producing contents that allow us to feel that we are powerful, we are socially efficacious, informing others' opinion, and we are becoming holders of the kind of contents that achieve and augment this mimetic content boost in the social environment. These contents will decondition inclination to test these against knowledge, reality, and against contradictions. And one of the last statement, if I may, that from the point of view of evolutionary psychology, it has been shown, and we understand now, that when the forces that form our beliefs are sometimes the kind of rational decision-making forces, checking against evidence, checking for coherence among content. However, there is beliefs in certain propositions, certain beliefs is increased to the degree that they serve social identification with groups in our environment. So people, the spread of fake beliefs like the flat earth movement can be shown to actually make people who are lonely, who are alone, who has no social efficacy to influence others, by taking these beliefs their own and displaying them, they become part of a community, and this is a highly reinforcing motivation for people to endorse beliefs. These are religious type of beliefs that are actually hard to test, however, are producing group belongingness in incredibly efficient ways are around. Now, the AI systems are reinforcing not only the spread of these kinds of beliefs, but also they are transforming the user's psychological motivations in producing, seeking beliefs and not testing beliefs in a way that would serve the rational purposes of coming closer to the truth and serving our instrumental purposes. Okay, I talked a lot. I'm sorry about it, but I as a psychologist working in the quickly growing tradition of evolutionary psychology and cognitive science, I find these, from these points of view, I find these developments even more alarming and more poisonous than just being stupid. That's what I wanted to call attention to. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I turn to you, to our audience. And
one brief remark?
Yeah, please do.
I enjoyed, does it sound good? I enjoyed both commentaries. I think there was a lot to think about. And I just want to combine thoughts from two of them very briefly. Sophia is basically asking about net benefits, her metaphor of paying more for customs after you're at the port. And the last talk is really about avoiding a poisonous society and the ways in which AI is contributing to that. I think that the core question here that emerges from my talk and those is, can we have a net socially beneficial AI if the AI itself doesn't do reality checking, critical argumentation, and so forth? It's almost as if there's two kinds of AIs that you could imagine, one that we have and one that we might want. The AI that we have is good at helping some people with productivity, but it's terrible at fact-checking, it's terrible at critical reasoning, and as the last commentary pointed out, this is poisoning society. We already saw this with social media, and it's just getting worse with AI, which repeats biases, for example. I gave you some illustrations of that. You could imagine a very different kind of AI that I think would be neurosymbolic, and maybe I'll get to that later, that would be grounded in facts, grounded in reasoning. If you know Kahneman's system 1 versus system 2 distinction, we have AI that's pretty good at system 1, that is kind of capturing the intuition of a lot of data that we've seen before, some of which is biased, for example. We'll perpetuate those biases. And then system 2 is supposed to be deliberative, kind of like what a Supreme Court should do in the ideal. Doesn't always, as I know from my country. But they would try to rationally reflect on things. And humans aren't very good at that. Csaba mentioned he likes my book Kluge. A lot of what my book Kluge is about is human irrationality and how we fail at a lot of those things. We would really like the AI to help us with the stuff that we're not good at. We're good at intuition, absorbing cultural biases, and things like that. We're not always good at this rational argumentation. An AI that can help us with that might be great. And then instead of giving it all back away at customs, maybe we'd actually have a net benefit. And that would be fabulous.
Thank you. And now you are on, but before we starting this part, I ask our discussion and Professor Pléh to sit back to the table.
Everybody.
Thank you. And now, do you have, any question or remarks? And we also have a micro.
I'm Ilona Kovac. I'm Gary. My question would be, so you train AI, ChatGPT on different texts, and the input is always human-generated text or something like that. And then, as you also mentioned, there are more specialized types. For example, the one that can learn to play chess or beat the world champion in Go and these kinds. Those you wouldn't say are unreasonable or stupid because they really beat the world champion, right? Is there any way to combine these different types, or can one learn from the other? That would be the question, yeah.
It's a very complicated and interesting question. I guess I'll go first, but maybe other people will want to comment. Even the smartest narrow AIs often aren't that smart. So for example, very interesting study by Stuart Russell's students recently, Berkeley professor, looking at, I guess it was AlphaGo was the best Go player. And it found basically that the best Go player was very good under normal circumstances. But if you played in unusual moves that no human would do, it actually fell apart. And what that showed you is that it doesn't really understand Go in full. It understands a kind of space of possible games that it's familiar with. But if you push it out of that, it actually falls apart. And a general thing with almost every kind of AI, not quite every kind of AI that we built, is that they don't handle unusual circumstances very well. Most kinds of AI that we know how to build are good in the ordinary circumstance, but we talk about outliers and they're not very good there. So that's something to bear in mind with respect to your first premise, that the smart ones aren't stupid. Sometimes, you know, they actually do kind of dumb things. The second part that I think is quite right is that I think human intelligence is an orchestration of many different narrow intelligences and many different aspects. You probably know there have been some brain scanning studies over the last 30 years. You put people in a scanner, some color picture comes back after you've done some image processing. It's a very expensive field of investigation that I think was not anywhere near as helpful as people thought it would be. But the one thing that's really interesting is that if you take a random person and you put them in a brain scanner and give them some new task that they've never done before, they will figure it out in 2 minutes what they should do, and they orchestrate the right parts of their brain to do it. In fact, if you have a bunch of different people doing the same task, they'll kind of do the same thing. So if you have a bunch of people watch a Hitchcock film, very full of suspense, and you look over time over the film, everybody is kind of trading off what parts of the brain do they use in this scene as opposed to that scene when things get scary, and this scene when people are trying to understand this, and so forth. So human beings are really good at orchestrating a bunch of different, maybe sometimes we call them modules, maybe that's the right term, maybe not, but I'll just use it for now. We have a bunch of different modules we apply to different purposes, and we're very good at figuring out right now in this moment. We don't do this consciously, but unconsciously, we draw on the right resources. I always think of this as like a conductor at an orchestra, getting the right people involved at the right moment. And we don't understand that in AI. We don't have a good way yet, we will someday, but we don't yet in AI have a good way of orchestrating all the different pieces of AI that we know how to build. And I think one of the breakthroughs that we'll have in the next decade or 2 decades, hard to predict, will be a much better way of doing that, of integrating the different resources, which is, I think, a lot along the lines of what you said. And I don't know if other people want to, if we want to have everybody answer each question or how we want to handle that. But thank you for the question.
Perfect, thank you. Any other questions or remarks? Yes?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation, the speeches. It was very exciting. So I would have 2 questions, basically. The first is a rather philosophical one with regards to natural intelligence. That's been on my mind for a while. So how is that the humanity is always more excited and curious about technological advances and artificial intelligence than its own intelligence, mainly, literacy, increasing literacy, or more advanced cognitive skills like critical thinking and creativity and problem solving. So why is the difference between the hype when it comes to artificial versus natural intelligence, if there's any, if there's the judgment?
I don't know the full answer to that, but I have an intuition about it. I think that for some people, AI is filling a need that was formerly filled by religion. I think we live in an age in which most people are atheists, or at least a much larger fraction than before, and that leaves people with a lack of sense of purpose and meaning. It's sort of depressing to think we're just molecules, we're all going to die. And so people are trying to fill that in, and they're getting some of the spiritual experience thinking they are part of what Ray Kurzweil calls a singularity, that we're going to be, we're going to take part in this magical moment when machines transform the world and so forth. And I think a lot of the technology enthusiasts are really treating it as a religion. They get very mad at people like me who question their religion and basically treat it as a heretic if you read the commentary on Twitter or something like that. I'm raining on the parade of them finding alternative sense of meaning. That's the first half of your question. The second half is the other stuff. Critical thinking is really hard. It's much easier to be a cheerleader and say, wow, look at this great thing, than it is to, for example, discipline yourself to reason scientifically about all problems, some of which give solutions that we don't particularly like. It's just much harder work to train yourself to do that, and most people don't really have that. There's also a psychological construct called the need for cognition, and some people have it and some people don't. Need for cognition is like, most little kids have this. They want to understand how things work and so forth, but it gets beaten out of them, they lose it, and most people don't really care anymore. They don't have that drive, and then this is an educational crowd. I think it's critical in education. How do you maintain that in a child for life? Most kids lose it eventually. You need a high need for cognition to look at something skeptically and say, okay, this is in the news, but is it true? Most people just don't have that. And I don't think we as a society cultivate that very well in anybody over like the age of 8 years old. And we could ask why that is, but I don't think we're very effective at it. So it's harder work, and most people don't feel a reward for doing that. Obviously, there's a class of society of intellectual people who maintain that for a long time, but it's not by any means the default.
László Zaborski, Rutgers University. So let's go back to your imaging studies you referred. So you think that AI helps to understand how human solving problems, or we would understand how AI solve the problems. So we would understand the brain organization, how it works.
So first thing I'll say is we don't really know how the brain does this thing. So this thing that I called orchestration, we can observe in a brain scanner that it's happening, but we don't know how it happens. We don't know kind of the causal mechanism by which I explain you're going to be in this experiment, and what I want you to do is every time you hear an odd number, touch your nose. Like, people can do that, but we don't know how people's brains actually guide them to take some arbitrary task and do that. Or my children, like, they'll learn the rules of a card game in a few minutes, and then they can just apply them. We don't know how the brain does it. We know that it does it. In principle, AI might help us analyze the data. So when I started studying neuroscience 30 years ago, we didn't have very much data about the human brain at all. We mostly only had brain scans that were very vague and so forth. We have a lot of data now. We don't actually know how to analyze it. The problem of neuroscience today is there are petabytes of data and nobody knows how to interpret it. So it's possible in principle that if we built AI that could, I think, reason more abstractly and causally, that the AI might help make sense of that data in a way that individual humans don't. It's also possible that we could learn something about neuroscience because someone is clever and we could port that idea over to neuroscience. There's actually, these things are called neural networks. And it's a little bit of, it's not quite a lie, but it's an exaggeration, right? They're called neural networks because they're inspired by a particular piece of neuroscience that was worked out in the 1960s. And most of the other things we know about neuroscience are not reflected in these systems at all. We could hope that someday we'll understand enough about the brain that we can improve AI. I'm not super optimistic about that happening soon. I think to understand the brain, we're going to need better AI. But I think the thing that people leave out is psychology, which is not as prestigious as neuroscience for dumb reasons, is actually really useful. I think we might make AI better by paying more attention to psychology. So maybe my theory is better psychology will lead to better AI, which will lead to better neuroscience. But we'll see.
I think that there are certain ways that what little we know about from neuroscience is actually shedding some light on what's wrong with the way AI systems are basically using language and using just a predictive function of sentences that they can finish in a plausible way every sentence, and basically the database is just linguistic expressions that are around us. Now, in our understanding of how language is comprehended by humans when it is used in communication, and what it shows is that our linguistic capacities, the way the brain is processing language, is interfaced in very important ways with other capacities. One is mind reading, the understanding of other people's and inferring other people's mental states. Also, the communicative intention that they want to transmit by using a sentence. So sentences are not just coding a literal meaning, but in conversation, it is always a pragmatic inference from context, from our general knowledge, and from our mind-reading capacities as to what the other wants to convey or express or make us believe by the way he's using language, linguistic expression in this particular way. So there is an interface with with theory of mind or mind reading or mentalization. These are names for this capacity. And we know that the language areas that are active in language comprehension, the Wernicke areas, are at the same location. They are interfacing with those areas that are shown to be involved in inferring others' mental states. So simulating the other's intentional mind state is part and parcel of our use of language, and you need these not directly linguistic capacities of inferring communicative and informative intentions of others to understand. The other kind of interface has to do with simulating the world, the physical world, basically to interpret sentences by imagining the situation they describe, where an embodied person is deciding where to go, what to do, and we are imagining the physical constraints on the situation using our naive physics or our understanding of solid objects movements, our understanding of biological agents movements, in order to imagine the situation and then from that to generate our ideas about the right answer. So the decision making using simulations of physical and sensory motor action realities as well as mental realities of other minds who are engaging in exchanging views with us. And so it's not just propositions in a linguistic format and the statistical probabilities of these, because in order, especially to what Gary has been emphasizing, for novel situations, for novel problems, you need these simulation, mental and physical simulation capacities to input the language, the linguistic system, to arrive at new beliefs, new solutions that are not just mimicking the statistical probability of previous inferences that has been around. And so we have some neural evidence showing that the linguistic system is deeply interconnected and is jointly activated in processing in the mentalizing system and with the simulating the physical world systems.
Thank you.
So my question would be about computing capacity. Like you've mentioned that we might have reached like a bottleneck between GPT-4 and 5. And can it be that we've reached like a computing capacity like in the 60s? Or what's your opinion about that?
About computing capacity?
Yeah, so like we can't make any more progress because we don't have the capacity to kind of have this exponential growth in GPT.
So I guess there are a couple of different questions there. The first thing I'll say is I think AI might be stuck for now. I certainly don't think it's stuck forever. I think that the AI that we have right now is not very efficient in terms of how much data it requires, how much energy it requires, how much water it requires. I don't think we're at some kind of mathematical or physical limit that says that we cannot do better. I don't think there's any law of nature that says we can't make machines that are much smarter than people. The ones we have now I don't think are as smart as people, but I certainly don't think there's any limit. There may be a limit to the architecture that we're using right now, right? There are different ways to build AI, and the way that is popular right now is to take a bunch of language data and maybe some other data, try to learn patterns over that, and use that as a way of anticipating what might happen in different contexts. We might be at the limit for that. There's some empirical evidence that people are kind of stuck at GPT-4. The evidence for that is imperfect, but it's that in 14 months, nothing has come better, and many billions of dollars have been spent by many competing companies. So, like, hypotheses get tested in science with money in some sense, and there's been a lot of money gone into the hypothesis that we can build something better than GPT-4, and so far those have been failures. That doesn't mean it's impossible. But if it is failing, why is it failing? And there are a couple of different theories that you could have, or maybe 3 different theories. One is it's a problem of running out of data. So the advances so far have pretty clearly been driven by taking larger and larger fractions of the internet. And now basically everything has been taken. Somewhere around 2021, all of these companies realized that more data was better, and they all basically took whatever they could. There's an interesting article in the New York Times about the kind of sleazy things that they have done to try to get more and more data. And they may have taken that strategy as far as it can go. There may not be enough useful data. One thing people are trying to do is to make up more data. This happened with driverless cars. 6 or 7 years ago, people realized they were running out of data, and they started making up data, like from video games. There's a video game called Grand Theft Auto 5. It's very kind of photorealistic. It's helped some, making up data, but it hasn't helped that much. Driverless cars still are very limited. They don't generalize beyond the cities where they're trained for and things like that. So one explanation is we've run out of data. And a lot of people are very seriously concerned about that. They're doing all kinds of things to try to address it, but that might just be the case. It might also be the case that like you need exponentially more data. So even if you had double the internet, that just might not help that much. And there is a theoretical paper recently, it was partly empirical, partly theoretical, arguing that to deal with outlier cases, unusual cases, you need an exponentially increasing amount of data. We may just not get that. So that's one possible issue. Another possible issue is it's actually hard to get enough GPUs, the processing units, to communicate with each other fast enough. And so people are working on that problem. There's also just like not a lot of high-powered GPUs in the world. And so it could be if we just build more chips and figure out cleverer ways to have those communicate with each other that we'll get past this using the current architecture. That's not my belief, but some people have that belief. And then I would say a third issue, for me, I think this is destined to fail, even if we get more compute and even if we get more data, because the world is constantly changing. And the premise of these systems is basically that you can do what you did in the past for the future, because basically what they're doing is just perpetuating past data. And my view is there's enough weird stuff happens in the world that that's never enough. So we've seen this in driverless cars. Train them on lots and lots of data, and there's still stuff that you didn't train them on that's problematic. My favorite example of this is with Tesla. There's a feature called Summon. And the idea is you press a button, and instead of driving from New York to LA, which Elon Musk promised 7 years ago, at least you can drive across a parking lot. And it works some of the time. But somebody tried this at an airplane trade show where people were showing off their airplanes, and somebody tried to show off their Summon feature, and the Tesla ran directly into a parked jet. The jet was not moving. It ran into a $3.5 million jet airplane because it was an outlier relative to the data that has been trained on. There are always outliers. In driverless cars, this has been the problem, is there are always things that aren't really covered by the data set, no matter how big the data set is. And my view is that we're always going to have that problem because new things happen in the world. They're just not all in the training set. And so if that's correct, then even if we have, 10x the current data, which means like 10 times the entire internet, there's an unthinkably large amount of data. There will still be new things that aren't there that systems will still fail on. So those are like 3 ways to think about this problem. Another thing is, maybe I'm wrong and next week GPT-5 comes out. But as far as I can tell, that's not that likely.
Thank you. I'm Andrea Carpati from Corvinus University. And so far we have been talking about text and oral language. And I want to ask you about visuals. Is ChatGPT culture or AI culture a threat for the arts and art making, or is it a promise? From the beginning of the history of art, most technological innovations were perceived as threats first, and then, of course, embraced. Computer technology is different. Multimedia and hypermedia art was born in parallel with computer advancement. So I'm honestly curious what you think. Critical thinking and art, will it be enhanced or threatened?
I have a mixed view there. So One thing is I think we should be worried about the use of copyrighted material, and so there's an economic issue. Putting aside, which I think is very serious. I mean, it's about people's intellectual property, and I'm very unhappy with just stealing everybody's intellectual property. But putting that aside, I think that there are both opportunities and costs. The cost is that a lot of people are being put out of work. The opportunity is some people will be able to make art, for example, or music that they couldn't make before. And we have seen that with earlier technologies. Like, there used to be a lot of studio session work for musicians where they would record things in order to make advertising jingles or whatever. And there just isn't as much of that work anymore because now you can use computer things, for example, to make drum beats that sound like human drum beats. And so there's just fewer jobs for the drummers. My view is that with respect to art, commercial artists who work for movie studios who do not make up completely new ideas in art, but are very competent at their trade, those people are really deeply threatened. The people at the cutting edge will always find something new. They will find ways to use the new tools. So fine artists, I think, will find ways to use these tools. People that are not at the leading edge are going to lose their jobs. That's how I think it's going to play out. And, we will all get to experience some new forms of art, and that will be great. And a lot of artists will be in trouble. The net effect on society is very interesting because many people will decide that they shouldn't go into art as a living. That it's just not safe anymore. I mean, a lot of 22-year-olds who are in art right now are regretting that they went into that profession and thinking about what to do with their life. The long-term consequence on society, I think, may be detrimental to the arts, but it's actually hard to know for sure.
Yeah, let me have an example for critical thinking that relates to your talk, and then a sort of tricky question. So I really liked your frame that while you were mainly talking about the moral and human implications of AI as it's self-advertising today, you were far away from the moral panic, and you translate it to actual issues. My example is about one of the actual issues you were giving about the issue of chips being produced in Taiwan and mainland China and so on. We are Hungarian, so we can go back 40 years. 40 years ago, in the mid-1980s, Hungary dreamed to be, and that's going to be an example for critical thinking, Hungary dreamed to be the first East European country to produce chips. They built a huge factory, and the factory, I'm going to be more precise at the end, but that's going to be the punchline about the date. So the factory in the mid-1980s, just before becoming really productive, burned down to zero level, burned down. Then here comes the critical thinking. In 20, 30 years later, everybody was curious. So they were looking for the CIA files, the available KGB files. There were two theories. One was CIA wanted to stop production of sensitive chips in Eastern Europe. The other was the Russians were really very jealous of Hungary being a freelancer, trying to produce chips on their own and so on. It seems to be that neither of them is true. CIA was certainly very active. They wanted to stop the exportation of the machines themselves from Switzerland, but the Hungarian, not the Hungarian spies were shitty, but the Hungarian merchants they knew corruption channels, so they corrupted with hand-held greasing money the Swiss border control at another station, and the machines came to Hungary. The real issue, and here comes, you really have to go critically into the details. It was certainly classified material, but unfortunately of another kind. It came out that the Hungarian engineers and physicists, they were very conscientious, very serious people, stopped the air conditioning system of the entire firm. Why? Because all of this was happening in May 1986, 3 weeks after the Chernobyl catastrophe. And they knew that the airing system was bringing radioactive material into the new chips. They wanted to stop it. They took the risks. And because of the chemicals there was the fire. But actually, they knew they were taking a risk, but they thought it would be more risky to pollute all the internet or using people or whatever, computer, using people with radioactive chips. You see, so and the critical thinking is that it took 10 years people to discover what was the real reason. There was a hidden reason, but not what it seemed to be a hidden reason on the first. Now, let me move to my question. You alluded several times that you have a general proposal how to improve AI. And I would like to ask you that in this general proposal, how you connect your ideas about the algebraic mind with the future of a better AI.
The first thing I'll say is I don't have a proposal. I have like a direction that people should research as opposed to detailed, this is the exact thing that we would build. I think that too much attention is being placed in one direction right now when we need to look in other directions. Fundamentally, there have been two approaches to AI since the beginning of the field, going back to the 40s and 50s, depending on how you date it. One of them has been neural networks, and there have been neural networks and people writing about neural networks since the 40s. And the other is symbolic AI. Symbolic AI looks more like classical computer programs. You have representations of things, you have variables, you have operations over those variables. If any of you have ever done computer programming, symbolic AI basically looks like that. And there are advantages and disadvantages to each approach. So the neural networks are very good at working with large amounts of data without having to do a lot of work, having them simply detect patterns and do learning over all of that data. But they're not very good at reasoning. They're not very good at abstraction. Their generalizations are always limited in various ways. And then you have these symbolic AI systems that are much more general, but it's very difficult to do any learning in them. There's some work in learning with respect to those systems, but they tend to be limited in their generalizability in certain ways. Limited, so you have to kind of hand tune them for particular situations. So what we want is really some of both of that. We want the precision that we get from symbolic systems, where we can, for example, work with databases. So we could say, does Gary have a pet chicken named Henrietta? And we could just look at a database and say, well, we don't have an entry there. So we could verify it. We could say we don't have any data on that. So we would like that precision that we get from the symbolic systems, but we would like to learn it across huge amounts of data. So the symbolic systems tend to work in a very narrow area, like chess or something like that. We don't really know how to learn rules across a broad domain, and we don't really know how to have these two systems talk to each other. So again, going back to Kahneman's System 1 and System 2, this neural network stuff is kind of like System 1, and the symbolic stuff is kind of like System 2. Humans don't always combine them perfectly, but we're pretty fluid about being able to combine them. In the AI field, we haven't been able to do that at all. And that's in part because the neural network systems are what we call uninterpretable black boxes. We feed in a lot of data, we get an output, but we don't really know how the system does what it does. The symbolic systems are much more interpretable. We really want to have that so that we can, for example, debug systems if they go wrong, or so that we can do the verification and things like that. So we know we need to, or we should know that we should try to combine these two traditions. The fact is, empirically, all of the money right now is going into making the System 1 stuff better by having more data, more compute, and so forth. And almost none of the research dollars are either going to the System 2 or into integrating the two. And so what I would say is we need more dollars on the System 2 and more dollars on integrating the two of them together.
Thank you. I would like to ask Professor Marcus of how should we use artificial intelligence from a practical point of view, for example, in teaching and learning. So I'm concerned about, for example, our postgraduate and PhD students' cognitive skills, how to improve, because artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, writes essays, papers, publications, and artificial intelligence solves problems, so they don't need it, not necessarily having problem-solving skills, memory, attention, concentration, thinking, creativity, and so on. So how should we control this situation? How should we motivate, for example, our students to improve their cognitive skills? So what would be your view?
I think this is very difficult. I was a professor for 25 years, and I'm kind of glad that I'm not right now, because I think it is so hard. I think there are some things that we can do, which I will suggest, but I don't have a full solution. This still live? You still hear me? So one thing that we can do, I think, is to allow students to use tools like ChatGPT. And there's some good reason to do that so that they can learn about the tools that are available and so forth. But to make it a teachable moment. So say, go ahead, write your paper with ChatGPT, but now I want you to tell me what mistakes it makes. I want you to analyze its output. Where is it hallucinating? Where is it too vague? And also, you can make it a writing exercise. So you can say, ChatGPT almost always writes something that's kind of boring, and there's a certain style that you come to recognize. What would a good writer do here? What's another way that you could write this essay? And so use that as an opportunity to have the students reflect on the art of writing, on having different perspectives and so forth. So I think that's one thing that you can do right now, is to say, go ahead and use it, but we're going to talk about the output, and we're going to use that as an exercise to learn more about the content, to learn more about writing, etc. So that's probably the best suggestion I have. A couple other things I would say is people have made tools to detect what is created by ChatGPT, and they're not very good. And they really would need to be perfect to be useful. So if you have a tool that identifies 90% of what's created by ChatGPT correctly and 10% wrong, you wind up falsely accusing a lot of students of using it. It didn't, and that's obviously not a good thing, and is not going to lead to a happy relationship with your students, et cetera. And so these tools are really not good enough in practice. It's very easy for someone to release a press release. We capture 90% of the fake papers. But if you think about what that means in practice, if you have 100 students and you falsely accuse 10 of them, and I'm ignoring some of the symmetrical, what we call signal detection stuff. But if you have something that's 90% accurate, it's just not actually good enough in the real world, in what's sort of like a criminal situation almost. You don't want to make a lot of mistakes. So I don't think we can do anything about that. Of course, there are other things. You can have more oral exams, and I'm sure lots of people have thought about that. The practicalities of like student to teacher ratios are such that you can't really do everything with oral exams. And maybe we will be forced to by ChatGPT, I don't know. And I'll say one last thing, which is there are things like Khan Academy which are trying to use these tools. And so far, I think they're problematic. The Wall Street Journal looked at Khan Academy's thing called Khan-Migo that teaches math, and it makes stuff up a lot. And the nature of the pedagogical relationship is you can't really do that very much. Like if the student loses faith in the teacher, then you're just not going to have any effective teaching. I mean, I used to lose faith in my teachers if they made a couple mistakes in a semester. I mean, if you have something that's going to make mistakes on a daily basis, then how do you know to trust it as a teacher? So I'm skeptical that current AI is going to be this revolution in education the way that some people think. I think right now the net benefits the costs are probably greater than the benefits right now, because they're unreliable and because it is kind of disrupting the evaluation system. So I think it's difficult right now. Eventually AI will be better. The ideal we should want really is tutoring for every single student, but it has to be trustworthy in order to get there, and I'm not sure the current technology sustains that. So that dream will come true, but I don't know if it'll come true in the next decade.
Thank you, and let's continue this discussion during lunch. And Oh, we have one more question. Okay, then one last, very last question, yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. You have mentioned that the AI has a geographical impact. And why do you think that the chip war between the USA and China is about the GPT-5?
I mean, the chip war is basically a set of export controls introduced by the US so that China can't get access to the fastest GPUs. And the fastest GPUs are being used to build GPT-5 level systems. So that just is what the war is about. I mean, you could argue that it's also about GPT-6 or something else that we invent, but it's certainly about limiting China's ability to build competing models. I wouldn't say it's that effective. And I think in the long term, it might have paradoxical effects. And I think people in the US realize this. It may force China to simply build more chips of its own, and they've invested $150 billion in their own. It's making Huawei a bigger player. So I don't even know if on its own terms it's going to be an effective solution. But it really is about GPT-5 and people's perception that that would be a destabilizing thing in the world if China had it before the US or something like that. I mean, that is what the war is about. I don't think it's going to be effective at its intended purposes, certainly not in the long term. I think there's a notion that maybe delaying China would be really important because whoever gets to AGI first will have a big strategic advantage, and so therefore the US should want to delay China. That's some of the reasoning. To me, a lot of it's nonsensical. The money that's being spent could be spent on building better AI. Whoever gets to better AI first will probably win, not who gets to more chips first, but that's my view and not a popular one in DC at the moment.
Thank you, and thank you so much for your activity. Thanks for our discussions. Thank you for the opening speech and the introduction. And thank you, Gary, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you.
And then being us. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now you all are invited for a small lunch. It will be upstairs on the first floor, and we can continue the conversation there. Thank you.